أناجي الحق في ليل بهيم أصدق النجوى وأدعو الله من قلب سليم يطلب التقوى أناجي الحق في ليل بهيم أصدق النجوى وأدعو الله من قلب سليم يطلب التقوى.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum, and welcome to another edition of Perspective. My name is Faizel Patel. Cage is an independent advocacy organization working to empower communities impacted by the war on terror. The organization highlights and campaigns against state policies, striving for a world free from oppression and injustices. Cage has been campaigning against the war on terror for more than a decade, with its work which has focused on working with survivors of abuse and mistreatment across the globe. Now, to tell us more in studio this evening, we have Cage Director Asim Qureshi. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Perspective.
Thank you very much.
First and foremost, briefly tell us about yourself and the work that you do for Cage UK.
So, as you mentioned, my name is Asim Qureshi. I'm the Research Director of Cage. And, you know, I've been involved in this work from the very beginning. I'm the first employee of the organization. I've traveled around the world investigating human rights abuses, particularly unlawful detention, torture, rendition and extrajudicial killings. So that's really been the focus of my work for now, I think, 13 years. So we've gone from strength to strength as an organization. We've had our challenges on the way, but our entire goal is to see an end to policies which ultimately impact upon not just Muslim communities, but communities all over the world through the fear that terrorism brings to states and the disproportionate legislation that they then enact to counteract that fear.
Okay. We know that a lot of viewers will be familiar with Cage UK. I've spoken and interviewed Muazzam Baig on the show last year sometime. With regards to the amount of sort of regional offices that you have, maybe give our viewers an idea of how many offices you have. I understand that you've just opened the Africa office.
That's right. So actually the Africa office is our first one. Just last week we opened an office in Cape Town, which we hope will become a hub for activists across South Africa to kind of get involved, to help assist our work. I think it's really important that we have a base here, especially when you see the problems that are going on in Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, the Horn of Africa. In a country like South Africa, where you have a government that is quite sensible in its approaches in dealing with its communities. You have a constitution, you have a Bill of Rights, and relative freedom to practice your religion, to practice your politics. I think South Africa is a really a fantastic place to actually have some of this activism, actually. Okay.
With Cage obviously taking on the role of supporting people and obviously tackling the war on terror, has there been a sort of a perception from Westerners or from the Western world that might possibly or allegedly associate your organization as, say, part of a terror organization or such?
Well, I mean, people say that we sometimes we sympathize with terrorism, but the reality is very, very far from the truth. Where individuals have been involved in terrorist plots, we've made no interventions whatsoever, because that's not our job. Our job is to remind our countries of their obligations to the rule of law, and it's that simply. We're not, but saying that, even if we dislike an individual and we feel that some of his opinions are odious or whatever else, we're not going to simply change our principles and say that he should be tortured because we don't like him. And there's people that I've represented who I don't particularly like, but I will always defend their right not to be tortured, not to be killed by drones, because it's exactly this kind of activity that makes the world a more dangerous place, not a safer one. And that's what we're in the business of, finding solutions that actually ultimately lead to more safe and just societies.
With regards to Cage, obviously you've got a number of regional offices, as we mentioned earlier. What impact has Cage got on influencing perception or opinions of say, policymakers across the world?
I think that ultimately that's exactly what we need to continue doing, the work that we've been doing already. Look, if you look at Guantanamo, there were 800 people detained at Guantanamo. How many of them were released through the use of law? None. They were all political releases. And the reason for that is that governments were embarrassed into taking these people back. And so we know that effective campaigning, effective lobbying, building a movement, being in cooperation with other organizations, ultimately results in a successful outcome. But you have to make that effort in order to push them into the corner and force them to make that change. And right now we've got a petition here in South Africa. This is Cage Africa's first mission, asking for the resettlement of Guantanamo detainees that have been cleared for release. For some of them, in the case almost for a decade, they've been cleared for release, to bring them here to South Africa. So we're petitioning the South African government. We want them to play a role in helping to solve this crisis of Guantanamo Bay.
Okay. With regards to the Muslim Ummah at the moment, we know that the Muslim Ummah is going through a difficult time. A number of groups like ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab. Do you think that these groups are portraying Islam in a negative way, I mean, with the acts that they portray or that they carry out, and is putting the Muslim Ummah under strain and difficulty?
I mean, it's a difficult one, obviously, because there are issues there.
Yes.
I think the thing that you need to do is think about these groups as a byproduct of our inability as Muslim communities around the world to deal with the grievances that our young people have, the lack of justice, the unlawful invasions. So often our young people are looking for answers to these problems which will provide them real solutions to them. But unfortunately we have a climate of fear in so many of our countries where our ulama, our scholars and our teachers and our leaders, they're not willing to talk about these things, and they're not willing to provide effective guidance and counsel. So what happens is that actually our young people end up going to other locations and other sources to find that information, which can sometimes lead to them falling into groups that maybe we're not so keen on them joining. Like I really actively promote the idea that we need our teachers, especially in the UK, to teach the fiqh of jihad and the history of it. But the problem is when you approach teachers to do this, they say, look, if we do this, we're going to be criminalized by the government. But I said, but the whole point is that if you're not teaching, as our leaders and our teachers, our young people about what the boundaries are of this subject, then how are we going to teach them what's right from what's wrong? And that's the problem, that this climate of fear is stopping us from actually giving the knowledge that our young people need, so that they can know what the boundaries of right and wrong are, and they don't feel like the generation before them are too scared to relate to their politics and their interests.
Okay. You were mentioning earlier that obviously the number of detainees that were released from Guantanamo want to be brought back into South Africa so they can sort of settle here. Given that in recent media report, and obviously the perception again in media that South Africa is a hotbed for terrorists, do you think that bringing the prisoners from Guantanamo here will sort of be well received by the government, or be entertained by the government, given the fact that South Africa has been described as a sort of a hotbed for terrorists?
Well, I think you need to provide some empirical evidence for why South Africa is a hotbed for terrorism. I was here in 2008 in Johannesburg for a conference on radicalization, and at that conference there were security officials from all over the world, and there was a South Africa intelligence officer who was there as well, and he said to me, look, we know our Muslim communities. There is no problem with terrorism in this country. We have a small problem with Pagad, which we know how to deal with, but in terms of terrorism, then our communities have no involvement with this thing whatsoever. And I think part of that is the lack of foreign intervention by South Africa in wars abroad, and this once again speaks to what the concerns of young people are. when governments aren't involved in these things, then you'll find that the community has a less antagonistic approach to the society around them. So I think that's a really important thing for us to bear in mind.
Mm-hmm. You tune to Perspective. This evening we're speaking to Asim Qureshi. He's the director of Cage UK, and we're discussing a number of topics, ISIS, and obviously the work that Cage does. Obviously they are a campaigner for human rights abuses, and also Muazzam Baig. Remember, we interviewed him on Perspective. Absolutely what a gentleman, and we're trying to highlight some of that work. We're going to go for a break. After the break, inshallah, we will continue speaking to Asim. Stay tuned to Perspective.
النجوى وأدعو الله من قلب سليم يطلب التقوى إلهي سرت في ظرف عصيب فاكشف البلوى فيا ربي أنا.
Welcome back to Perspective. My name is Faizel Patel. This evening we're speaking to Asim Qureshi. He's from Cage UK. Remember, you can interact with me by sending me a mail on Faizel at itvnetworks.tv. Drop me a tweet on @Faizi143, or you can even comment on facebook.com/Faizel Patel. Asim, before the break we were speaking about some of the detainees being brought to South Africa. Speaking specifically about South Africa and the world, we are seeing a number of people, young people, especially impressionable young adults, joining groups like ISIS and Boko Haram. Specifically ISIS, we've had incidences in this country where a number of families have moved across through Turkey to join the Islamic State. Why do you think this is so? Why are people in droves, reportedly in droves, moving on to be part of the Islamic State? Obviously there might be different perspectives to do humanitarian work, and they might have different agendas. Some people want to generally do humanitarian work, some people want to live under an Islamic State. I always refer to it as Orania in South Africa, and then some people genuinely want to fight, and obviously take the fight to the Western world and bring on an Islamic culture within the world. But your thoughts and comments on that?
I think it's important for us to understand that people go to the Islamic State for a multitude of reasons. There isn't one kind of homogenous thinking that goes into it. Some of them believe in everything that they do. Some of them believe that everything that's in the media about them is a conspiracy theory, and actually the reality is a much more peaceful and just society. So, it's difficult to comment on what's exactly going on over there and why people what their specific reasons are, yes, unless they come back and you can speak to them. But I think what should be commended here is the South African government's approach, yes, to the returnees, because I think there is this notion that a lot of people who are going over there are very, very sincere in their intentions. They want to go over there because they believe that they can live as practicing Muslims in an environment that won't judge them, that won't laugh at their niqab, that won't laugh at them having a beard, that they don't have to go around seeing billboards of things that they might find objectionable. Yes. They don't have to send their kids to school. So they have a very idealized view of what that might be. And perhaps maybe the reason they're coming back is because that didn't fit exactly with their understanding of their model of what they were hoping for. Mm-hmm. It's important to speak to these people and understand obviously where they're coming from. But, and I think South Africa's model of allowing them to come back, yes, without very much scrutiny, allowing them to resettle, I think that is a very positive approach, and it speaks of a government that is thinking about these things in a way that's human rights compliant, justice compliant, mm-hmm, and in fact is a model that we should actually be exporting to other countries, saying rather than criminalizing these people, mm-hmm, let's learn from them, learn from their experiences maybe later once they've had a chance to settle in, and see how we can use that. All right.
Now in February this year it was reported you had exchanged emails with Mohammed Emwazi, the Londoner, revealed to be Jihadi John, as many of the viewers will know, in the years before he traveled to join ISIS in Syria, where he went on to appear in the execution videos of Western hostages. Now, you've described him as a beautiful person. Mm-hmm. Maybe explain to our viewers how you came to that conclusion, and obviously a little bit about the emails that was exchanged between the two of you.
Well, it wasn't just me, it was many people. His school teachers, his employer in Kuwait said he was one of the best employees that he ever had. His teacher said that he was extremely kind and generous individual. Yes. So this was a consistent narrative about him as a young man growing up in the UK. we actually released the emails ourselves. And the reason we did that is that we wanted people to look at the hard evidence. Here he is, as a young man in the UK who's having some great difficulties traveling to Kuwait, where he had a job, he had a prospective bride waiting for him, and the security agencies decided to put restrictions on his life, which he wasn't able to challenge. So we released the emails to show that, look, there's a young man trying to use the mechanisms of state to change his situation, to use the rule of law to change his situation. But he's being blocked at all fronts because you can't challenge the decision the security agencies make against you. So the question we were asking is, did the security agencies play a role in him leaving the UK? Not that the security agencies turned him into allegedly Jihadi John, but rather did they play a role in him feeling like he didn't belong in UK society any longer?
Now, obviously, you also come under fire from a London mayor, Boris Johnson, after accusing MI5 of radicalizing Mohammed Emwazi. Obviously, you spoke about his, the beauty of the person prior to him joining ISIS. Obviously, your comments on the London mayor's allegations? I think
that Boris Johnson misunderstood what we were trying to say. Whether that was willful or it was just because of media reporting, I don't know. But the reality is that's not what we were saying. What we were saying is that we want accountability for the period that he was in the UK. Perhaps had his life been different, perhaps if he had been permitted to go to Kuwait, he might have turned out differently. And so we need to have an accountability process because we need to learn lessons. If it turns out that MI5's role in all of this resulted in him leaving the UK and ultimately ending up and falling in with ISIS, then in order to make sure that doesn't happen to other young people, we want to extract lessons from that. So it's all about accountability, actually.
Okay. You've also been quoted in a BBC interview, and this is slightly more controversial, as saying Sharia isn't practiced correctly and refused to condemn stoning of death of women that probably commit adultery or whatever the case may be. Your comments on that?
I think this is kind of an irrelevant discussion because actually this, especially in the context that we have in the UK, there is no relevance to that. Nobody's going around stoning anybody to death as far as I'm aware. In fact, I don't know of any real examples, but I can tell you one thing. If I ever found out that somebody, had been found guilty of being stoned to death or found guilty of adultery and was about to be stoned to death, then I would take exception to that because I don't think it's possible from what I understand of the way for that situation to ever emerge. So, this is something that's quite interesting. Why is there a focus on this when actually the focus should be on the 1.37 million Muslim lives that have been lost since the war on terror began, according to the Physician for Human Rights. I mean, I can tell you one thing, I've never perpetrated a human rights abuse against anyone anywhere in the world. And so this media narrative about kind of turning the script, that just because your Quran or your religion or your Sharia might believe in something from a kind of a conceptual level, that somehow that makes you an evil, terrible person. Whereas we're not perpetrating abuses against anybody. I can guarantee you that right now. But there are plenty of people out there who are perpetrating abuses against Muslim communities, and they're trying to fudge that issue.
Absolutely. Now, the one thing that really bothers me, and I think a lot of people and Muslim people will feel this, that maybe one person will do something in the name of Islam. He claims to be a Muslim, and it's unfortunate that the entire Muslim community then get labeled as one or get put into the same basket. As Muslims, as ambassadors of people that fight human rights abuses, how do we avoid the stigma of being labeled by somebody committing an act that is totally contradictory to the teachings of Islam?
Well, what we do is that we empower ourselves to kind of retain our own narrative about who we are, rather than allowing for a narrative to be imposed on us. And part of that is language. When we start using words that have never existed within 1500 years of Islamic jurisprudential history, like, for example, Islamist or extremist, what we do is we fall into a narrative that's been superimposed on top of us. In fact, we need to own the narrative about ourselves. We need to describe the various phenomena that we're going through in a language that we know and we understand is compliant with our culture and history. The problem is we often don't do that. We just take the accepted narrative and we try and define ourselves in relation to that. And I think it's time that Muslims really, across the world, said, no, let's take stock, let's think about these issues, and let's talk about how it is that we define our own characters and our own religion in a way that makes sense to us and makes sense to our religion, and not just because we're scared about the environment that we live in.
Asim, we just got a minute left. Your last thoughts and comments before we conclude?
I mean, really, I hope that the people of South Africa will support Cage Africa in its goal to actually bring about more just societies. Our first office is in Cape Town. You can get in touch with us through our website, which is cageuk.org. And we will definitely pass on your details to our team, who hopefully will be able to work closely with you to actually bringing about these more just and safe societies we're all looking for.
Asim Qureshi, absolute pleasure to have you on Perspective this evening, and thank you for the insight in the many questions that we've posed this evening. That was Asim Qureshi giving us some perspective on a number of issues that's plaguing the Muslim community, and also some other issues that's sort of emanating around the world. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this week's edition of Perspective. Remember, you can interact with me by sending me a mail on Faizel@itvnetworks.tv, drop me a tweet on @Faizi143, or even a comment on facebook.com/Faizel Patel. And remember, you can tune in again next week, where we cover stories that are making headlines locally, nationally, and internationally. From myself, Faizel Patel, and the magnificent team here at ITV, fi amanillah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
أناجي الحق في ليل لهيم أصدق النجوى وأدعو الله من قلب سليم يطلب التقوى أناجي الحق في ليل لهيم أصدق النجوى وأدعو الله من قلب سليم يطلب التقوى سرت في ظرف عصيب فاكشف البلوى فيا ربي أنا عبد لرد الضيم لا يقوى أعني ربي في أمر